Good evening to everyone. Welcome. If you're visiting with us, we want to let you know that you're our welcomed and honored guests, and we want to let you know that if you have any questions about what we do, we'd be very happy to talk to you. Anything that is taught or said, and you would like to know more or discuss it, we're happy to do that with you. And also let you know that I am not the preacher here, that our brother Eddie is out today, and I'm filling in for him, so please bear with my stumbling, and hopefully it goes fairly smoothly, but we'll do our best to. So it's interesting that the lessons today, Brother Josh this morning preached about the ancients, about the footsteps of the ancients, and as following them or learning by their mistakes. And he highlighted a few different things from the Old Testament, especially about things that we should learn from as God's people, that we should learn as students of the Bible as we read it, that directions that we need to not follow. And so this evening, actually, this lesson could be titled the same as Josh's from this morning. But I've chosen to entitle it Embracing God's Promises, the Walls of Jericho. I'd like to look at simply one specific incident that Franco just introduced from Hebrews 11 that we read when we're talking about probably one of the most familiar chapters to the Bible student is Hebrews 11. We like to read it because it encourages us in the direction of faithful men and women and people. And really, I'm talking about the Israelites tonight. We're not talking necessarily about a specific man. We'll talk about Joshua. So we're familiar with this particular event as Bible students, and the walls of Jericho are an event that our young people talk about in classes, their Bible classes. They grow up learning about the walls of Jericho from the 6th chapter of the book of Joshua. And I'd like to remind us all tonight that the victory of God's people over the Canaanites and the city of Jericho was a direct result of God's people trusting his promises, trusting his word and what he said, and their obedience to his instructions. And what lessons that we can learn from these events recorded for us and make application to our lives. So hopefully if you've stayed in Hebrews chapter 11, we'll look briefly at a few things. I'm not going to read through it. Franco kind of introduced it to us, but I want to remind you that it starts off by talking about faith and what faith is. And verse 1 says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." And our conviction and our hope are what we're going to be talking about and highlighting tonight. And so these men, let me briefly remind you of who this chapter talks about, some of who. Abel, he offered a more excellent sacrifice, verse 4 tells us. And Enoch, he pleased God, in verse 5. Noah, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, verse 7. About Abraham, went out not knowing where he was going, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, verses 8 through 10. And then down, Abraham's on the list twice, down in verses 17 through 19, reminded that Abraham's faith in offering up Isaac, his only begotten son, through whom the promises are made. Sarah, that through her faith she conceived in her old age, by which a multitude, a nation, was born, the scriptures tell us, verses 11 and 12. Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come, in verse 20. Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped leaning on the top of his staff, in verse 21. And then Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones, verse 22. And notice something about the faith of those men that is highlighted at the end of their lives, because we'll be talking about it. I mean, there's several things that could have been said about really Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, but really it was at the end of their life and pointing forward that this great event of faith is shown in their words, the things that they had to say, the blessings that they passed on. They were based on the promises that God had given them. And then Moses, down in verses 24 through 26, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. For he looked to the reward, verse 24, forsaking Egypt, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. It says that Moses saw him who was invisible. And that's an interesting statement, because when we think about seeing something, the concept of invisible, it contradicts it. But that's what we're talking about in faith. And then about the walls of Jericho in verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were enriched, encircled for 7 days. Verses 32 through 38 continue on and talking about the different men of faith when it talks about, I'll finish reading that chapter there. And what more shall I say? For time will fail me when I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and David, and Samuel, and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting their release so that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword, and went about in sheepskins, in goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. And these all, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised. But God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. So, what is the Hebrew writer talking about there in those latter verses? He's highlighting the great faith that these men had, but he also says something about them not receiving the promises. As Franco read in verse 13, we do see this driving motivation of these heroes of faith. When it says, these all died in faith, not having, again, received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. And so, I forgot to say what my 3 words were, but they're seen, assured, and embraced. And they all come from this verse. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. So it's seen not in the sense of, I see you, you see me now, but seen by their faith. They saw what God had promised them to the point that it affected them, that they embraced those promises, and it changed their lives. The promises that were given to these heroes of faith, there were many, but it all stemmed from these promises in Genesis 12 and verses 1 through 3 that were given to Abraham. And in most of their cases, they did not see any of these fulfilled. And in all of their cases, they didn't see the ultimate and most important promise that was given to Abraham in that verse, which reads, "Now the Lord said to Abraham, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And it is that final statement that in Abraham's seed, all the nations would be blessed. And it was of that the prophets of old spoke. It was of that promise that they were constantly and consistently reminded of. And it was of that promise that drove them to do the things that we talked about and we were reminded about in Hebrews chapter 11. So again, let me just remind you that having what it says in verses 37 and 38, before we move on and specifically talk about the events of Jericho, I want you to think about this verse again. "Having seen them afar off, were assured of them, and they embraced them, looking toward the coming Savior." The information that God gave the patriarchs Abraham and the Israelites ultimately to the prophets, it was not instant gratification. They lived their lives not seeing that promise fulfilled. It would involve trusting the source of the promise. That's what drove them, trusting the source of the promises and having the ability through the eyes of faith to see that the promises that God made would be completely fulfilled. For the most part, again, in Abraham's case, they were not fulfilled in his lifetime. And the New Testament talks about this kind of driving faith too. We won't be talking about it much tonight, so much. Again, we're going to focus on Jericho. But I just want you to think about one very familiar verse from Philippians 3:13 and 14, where Paul says, "Brethren, I do not count myself as apprehended, but one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forward to those things which are ahead, I press toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of Jesus Christ." It is also that Paul walked by that same by faith in the promises of God, and as we also must walk. All right, so Joshua chapter 6. If you would turn there, and we'll discuss the events kind of leading up to the events of if I can find the right slide. Of the walls of Jericho. I want to remind you of just the first few chapters. Israelites had been in the wilderness for 40 years. That time was coming to an end, and now it was time for them to enter the land that God had promised them. In chapter 34, we could read in verses 4 through 12 about the death of Moses and the things that he had warned them about and promised them, passing on, again, God's promises. In Joshua chapter 1, God tells Joshua that he will be the one to lead the nation of Israel into the promised land. The second chapter is when they send the two spies into Jericho. They're hidden by Rahab the harlot, and these are who also Hebrews chapter 11 speaks of about regarding Rahab's helping the spies and the promise to save her and her family from imminent destruction in chapter 2, verses 12 through 14. The spies safely returned, telling Joshua that the Lord had delivered all the land into our hands, for indeed all the inhabitants of the country are faint-hearted because of us. Chapter 2, verse 24. And then in chapters 3 and 4, God parts the Jordan River, the song that we just sang. And the nation of Israel crosses over it, an amazing occurrence in which God's power and Israelites' obedience, obedience is demonstrated. And this is another, Joshua 5 is circumcision of the Israelites. Now this is a new generation. Remember, this is pretty much not the ones that we talk about leaving during the time of Exodus. This is 40 years later. And this was important to God, the mark of God's covenant people to whom the promises were delivered. Genesis 17, 10 through 11. And we went to remember regarding this is that the attitude that we're seeing coming from the Israelites, while some of the events that Josh talked about this morning was bad. And we know that as Old Testament students, we see this up and down of the Israelites following God. And this is a high point as far as their obedience and their willingness to follow God and do what he wanted them to do. And so we see many good examples regarding their faith. And then also just closing as we begin to look quickly at chapter 6 and the walls of Jericho. In chapter 5 and verses 13 through 15, now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with a sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" He said, "No, rather I indeed come as captain of the hosts of the Lord." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, "What has my Lord to say to his servant?" The captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. The commander of the army of the Lord. Note Joshua, what I wanted you to see here is his humble obedience and reverence to the authority of God and his holiness. This would serve Joshua well in the future, as it has previously in his life, and the assurance that the Almighty God was with him and his people. And so this is the attitude of the people. This is the attitude of the leaders as they approach the walls of Jericho. So I want to read quickly chapter 6, and then we'll just talk about it and we'll make some applications. Now, Jericho was tightly shut because of the sons of Israel. No one went out and no one came in. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand with its kings and valiant warriors. You shall march around the city, all the men of war circling the city once. You shall do this for 6 days. Also 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. Then on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. It shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall flat, and the people will go up every man straight ahead." So Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord." Then he said to the people, "Go forward and march around the city, and let the armed men go on before the ark of the Lord." And it was that when Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. The armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark while they continued to blow the trumpets. But Joshua commanded the people, saying, "You shall not shout, nor let your voice be heard, nor let a word proceed out of your mouth until the day I tell you, shout. Then you shall shout." So he had the ark of the Lord taken around the city, circling it once. Then they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp. Now Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord, the 7 priests, carrying the 7 trumpets of the ram's horns. Before the ark of the Lord went on continually and blew the trumpets, and the armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord, while they continued to blow the trumpets. Thus the second day they marched around the city and returned to the camp. They did so for 6 days. Then on the 7th day they rose early at the dawning of the day and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they marched around the city 7 times. At the 7th time, when the priest blew the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city shall be under the ban. It and all that is in it belongs to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot and all who are with her in the house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But as for you, only keep yourselves from the things under the ban, so that you do not covet them and take some of the things under the ban. Make the camp of Israel cursed and bring trouble on it. But all the silver and the gold, the articles of bronze, iron, are holy to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord." So the people shouted, and the priest blew the trumpets. And when the people heard the sound of the trumpets, the people shouted with a great shout. And when the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. They utterly destroyed everything in the city, both men and women, young and old, and ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, "Go into the harlot's house and bring the woman and all she has out there, as you have sworn to her." So the young men who were spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brothers and all that she had. They also brought out all her relatives and placed them outside the camp. They burned the city with fire and all that was in it. Only the silver and the gold and the articles of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. However, Rahab the harlot and her father's household and all that she had, Joshua spared, and she has lived in the midst of the city to this day, midst of Israel to this day, for she had hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Then Joshua made them take an oath at that time, saying, "Cursed before the Lord is the man who rises up and builds this city Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation, and with the loss of his youngest he shall set up its gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was all in the land. So, an impressive series of events. I can't help but be moved every time I read that chapter and see this powerful miracle performed and the promise of God unfold. So just a few notes to look at and then make application to our faith in this. Note the people of Jericho were clearly in fear of the Israelites, because they had heard of the events as Rahab had told the spies back in Joshua 2:9 through 11. She mentions that they had heard of the Exodus, and they had heard of the events of Israel and God being with Israel in the wilderness. And then just wanted to mention something about the walls of Israel. The walls of Jericho. Not that we really need this for our faith, but there are some archaeological finds that they definitely found the city of Jericho when they found the evidence of the collapsed walls. But I just wanted to give us a perspective, and so much evidence leads to, the facts of this event. But we believe it because God told us and because it's written. But I wanted to show this drawing for us to just think about what we just read. And I want to read from an article about the excavation just quickly that describes this wall. Based on the archaeological finds, the mound or the tell of Jericho was surrounded by a great earthen rampart or embankment with a stone retaining wall at its base. The retaining wall, which you see at the bottom of that illustration, was some 4 or 5 meters or 12 to 15 feet high. On top of that was a mud brick wall 2 meters or 6 feet thick and about 6 to 8 meters or 20 to 26 feet high. At the crest of the embankment was a similar mud brick wall whose base was roughly 14 meters or 46 feet high, or 46 feet above the ground, level outside the retaining wall. This is what loomed above the Israelites as they marched around the city each day for 7 days. So I just wanted you to get an idea from that illustration of what they saw, of what they were seeing, and what kind of faith it would take to say, if you march around this as God has instructed you, it's going to collapse. It's going to fall. Moses talked in Deuteronomy in the 9th chapter, and we don't really have time to go back there and read, but he talked about that the intimidating things that they would face in his closing remarks to the Israelites, and Joshua and the people's obedience to God's instructions. And what we read about was God's specific instructions in this chapter that we just looked at, verses 2 through 5. He gives them, Joshua, very specific instructions. And Joshua's instructions to the people in verses 6 and 7 were then also very specific. And so it was that the people obeyed God's instructions in verses 8 through 11, as we just read. The unusual nature of God's instructions to destroy Jericho were really unprecedented at this time. This was not the way that cities were taken, but there was no indication of the people questioning God's instructions. And I find that interesting, and I find that a pretty good lesson for us, for us to about whether we question some of the instructions that God has given us because we haven't done it before, we haven't heard it done that way. But that's the way that God instructed them to do it, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. God could have chosen any way to make the walls come down and destroy Jericho, but he wanted to give the people an opportunity to obey. In verses 8 through 9, the priest rolling on bearing the 7 trumpets of the ram's horn and blowing the trumpets, and the ark of the Lord following them, the armed soldiers going before the priests and the ark of the covenant. We read of them doing exactly what they were specifically told to do. And this, at this point, just kind of, again, makes me think. So it was the obedient response of God's instructions. So it was. So what does it mean to see God's promises, to be assured of the promises, and to embrace them, as we read back in Hebrews? Well, this is it. We're seeing it unfold. We're seeing what it means to embrace God's promises, because he told them to go out and march around that city, and it's going to fall. The walls will fall. And how it's manifested is by obedience of his instructions, not by mere words or acknowledgement that in his existence or anything about him. It's actions, and that's what we're seeing here. And I definitely see a parallel regarding baptism. Some question the need or brush it off as unimportant. The question should be, did God tell us to do it? And if you can see it and that he commanded it, which the scriptures are clear, we do it. As the Israelites did, as obedient people do. These people, the Israelites at this time, and the reason I said a few minutes ago that this was a high time, a good time for the Israelites, was because they were ready to do whatever God had commanded. In verse 10, the people were instructed not to shout, to make any noise with your voice, nor shall a word proceed out of your mouth. Do you think that the people took that literally? Can you picture, God told Joshua told the people. Do you think when they were walking around the walls that they engaged in casual conversation or I don't know for sure, but I think they took it literally. So the answer I would answer is yes. It was serious business. And then we read about Joshua as a leader in verse 12. It says he rose early. Two simple words. He rose early. But this is said about Joshua several times, about him rising early. I see this as an indication of preparedness of a leader. He took his role seriously, as a leader should. Impressive to me and a great example. There was never an indication on Joshua's part of complaining, nor was there indication on the people's part at this point. And then note the attention to following God's instructions in detail in verse 14. It says, and the second day they marched around the city wall once and returned to the camp. They did so 6 days, exactly how God had instructed. And then on the seventh day, verses 15 through 19, again, we see the obedience of the people, that this had come to the point where they were to shout. So it's interesting to me to think about these events as they unfold. This was a week. This was 7 days. It wasn't a quick thing, and the people had a lot of time to think. At this point in time, and all that the people had done, the blowing of the trumpets, the silence, the march around the walls, and the walls were still there. Nothing has changed up to this point. 6 days of marching around the city. Something they had never seen happen, something that had not happened before. Do you think that might have affected their attitude a little bit? Would they have grown weary? I mean, they could have become discouraged. And they could have said, look, this is growing old. Nothing's happened. But they did not. They continued in their obedience to God's instruction, regardless of the current circumstances, regardless of what was going on around them. And there's a lot of great lessons there we don't have time to cover. Joshua was true to the promise that he made to Rahab by the spies in Joshua 2 and 12 through 13. Rahab's life and that of her families were saved. A great example of the keeping promises that were made. In verses 18 and 19, the specific instructions were again given to the people to abstain from the accursed things. We could read on and see that, unfortunately, they did not do that when we read of Achan in the next chapter, verse 21. The events of Achan taking the beautiful Babylonian garment for which he would die, and the Israelites would suffer great defeat. But at this point in time, they listened to God. And what's interesting about this to note is that when Joshua is saying this as though it had happened, he's talking about what's going to happen when it falls and what you're to do to the city. So again, Joshua, here, 6 days, they've done exactly what God had said, and nothing has happened yet. But he's talking about it as though it already occurred. He knew it was going to happen. That's a great example of faith. Verses 20 and 21, so the people shouted, priests blew the trumpets. The result of the strict obedience to God's instruction was the fulfillment of his promise. The city was destroyed. The children of God were successful because of their obedience to God's instructions. And we've already mentioned Rahab's family being spared. 26 and 27, Joshua curses Jericho, saying it should never again stand. This was all due to the Canaanite sin and rebellion. They deserved what they received from God at this point, but the people of God benefited by their obedience. And so I want to just conclude by just mentioning some promises that we have. I know we're out of time, but I want to say something, kind of help us to think about tying this into our own faith and our embracing the promises of God. Because it is so important. This was an important lesson that God left to us. This really happened. The walls of Jericho fell. And God's promises for us today are really based on some of the promises that were made to Abraham and the patriarchs regarding all the nations of the earth being blessed. But we were able to see this promise fulfilled of the blessing to all nations. 2 Peter 1:4 tells us about the exceeding great and precious promises God has given to us. And we've seen them fulfilled. So I just want you to think about a few of these things. And this is not an exhaustive list. But God has promised us the forgiveness of sins. Do we embrace that? Do we see that as true and embrace it in our walk, in our daily walks? What about knowing that God has promised us that our prayers are answered? In Acts 10 and 4. God's promise of his divine presence in our lives. We talked about that in some of our classes and recent lessons, that God is with us. Romans 8:31 tells us that he is, and his promise is that he will be with us in our lives. Talking about the resurrection of life, Romans 6:5, and eternal life for God's people from 1 John 2:25. There's so many promises that God has given us. And the question is, do we have the kind of faith? Are we at the same level that was demonstrated by the Israelites when they walked around the walls of Jericho? Are we able to demonstrate that kind of faith and embrace the promises that God has given us in his word? And is it reflected in our actions, in our lives, in the things in our obedience to him? So the question that I'd like to ask you as we close, are you embracing the promises of God like the children of Israel did? If you have a need tonight to render obedience to God's call through baptism, we'd like to assist you with that. Or if you have a need to let your sins be known and ask for the forgiveness of them in a public way, we invite you to come forward as together we stand and sing.